I'd like to spend the next few minutes to give you an overview of the broader economic and fiscal context in which the teachers' bargaining dispute is taking place. And I also want to take the time to debunk a few myths about what we can and cannot afford in this province. The BC government falsely claims that in today's slow economy, the proverbial cupboard is bare, and there's nothing we can do to address our most pressing social, environmental, and economic challenges. We all know that the BC economy is slow. It's losing steam, and most of you probably have friends or family members who are unemployed and are having a hard time finding jobs that pay well or provide enough hours to support them and their families. Our economy is only expected to grow sluggishly over the next few years, but that doesn't mean that our provincial government is broke. Provincial finances, in fact, are in much better shape than the government's rhetoric would leave you to believe. The budget is in deficit, and you've all probably heard that. But how many of you know that the government forecasts are actually deliberately lowballed? They're projecting revenue growth at much lower levels than private sector growth forecasts would suggest. And this isn't new. There is a trend that can be seen over the last 10 years with government in BC lowballing revenue forecasts and ending the fiscal year with deficits that were at least $1 billion lower than originally projected, or surprise surpluses in the order of $1 to $3 billion higher than what was originally in the budget. This year is no different. Moreover, this year's budget shortfall appears larger than it truly is because of a convenient accounting shortcut. In fact, roughly half of the $2.5 billion budget deficit for this year is due to an accounting rule that is forcing the BC government to put the entire $1.6 billion HST funding repayment to the federal government in this year's budget, even though we negotiated a 5-year repayment plan with the federal government where BC is going to pay every year $320 million and have no interest over the 5 years. So even though we're only paying $320 million this year, the full $1.6 billion is part of the budget deficit. In fact, when you look beyond that, you see that the real shortfall is more like $1.2 billion. And even that, half of that is forecast allowance and contingency allocation, which is essentially fiscal padding, just in case the government forecasts were incorrect. At $1.2 billion, our budget deficit is less than 1% of the provincial economy, measured by GDP. In fact, it's 0.6% of GDP. This is one of the smallest budget deficits of all provinces in Canada, and it certainly gives us a lot of room to maneuver. What this means is that we're not broke, and the net zero mandate for public sector bargaining is not an economic imperative, but rather a political choice that the BC government is making. Practically speaking, it's not real fiscal constraints that are holding back government spending, but a lack of political will. Our deficit is relatively small, and our debt level is very reasonable. When considered as a share of the total provincial economy or our ability to pay, our debt levels are among the lowest in the country. Provincial debt is currently less than 16% of our GDP and is projected to increase slightly to 18.3% and peak there and stabilize afterwards. So this is far from the 100% debt to GDP ratio that we see in Greece and other European countries who are really having trouble. We're nowhere near there. In fact, even when you take account of federal debt, we notice that Canada is in an enviable position fiscally compared to all other big economies. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. Despite the current government's phobia of debt and deficits, economists tell us that it is okay to take on government debt when certain conditions are met. That can be good public policy if it's used to make public investments that will benefit us in the future. That can be good public policy if it is stable as a share of the economy and if the interest rates are not too high. Currently, we're seeing record low interest rates. Our debt is stable as a share of the economy and very small relative to other provinces and countries. And we need a lot of public investments. So it is a good time to borrow a bit more to finance social and capital investments that will benefit us all in the future. Things like education, things like healthcare, things like strong public services that benefit everyone. But taking on more debt is not the only way we can fund these services that we need. So far, efforts to reduce the deficits have focused disproportionately on one side of the budget ledger. They have focused on demands to reduce services, to reduce wages, and reduce social programs. The other side of the ledger, taxes, has been conspicuously missing from the public debate. In fact, BC's personal and corporate income taxes, our most progressive taxes in this province, are both record low compared to the rest of Canada, and there is room to do something on the tax front. It's clear to anyone who looks at the numbers that BC doesn't have a spending problem. Yes, our spending is increasing in straight-up dollar terms, but so is the population we need to serve and the economy. When we look at spending as a share of the economy, which economists tell us is the best measure of government spending over time, we see that our spending has actually fallen over the last decade and fallen quite significantly. In 2001, the BC government spent about 22% of GDP, while this year, 2011-12, government spending accounts for only 20% of GDP. And spending is projected to fall in this budget over the next few years, even below 20%. So this may sound like small changes, but the BC economy is about $200 billion a year. So in fact, 2 percentage points of our GDP are about $4 billion a year. So we see a significant decrease in government spending over the last decade. And then it becomes clear that our deficit is not caused by a spending problem, it's caused by a revenue problem. The real reason why we're seeing a deficit is that the government deliberately cut its size over the last decade through a series of tax cuts. BC now boasts the lowest personal income tax rate for individuals earning up to $120,000. BC also has the lowest corporate income tax rate. We're tied here with Alberta and New Brunswick. So there is room to move. Corporations and high-income earners are the ones who benefited the most from the tax cuts over the last decades. But the income tax cuts have largely gone unnoticed for most middle-income and low-income families. If you ask yourself, do you feel like you're paying less taxes now than 10 years ago? Most of you would say no. That's because the tax cuts were paralleled with increase in user fees, things like MSP premiums, which are increasing again next year for the 4th time since 2009. While tax cuts have gone unnoticed by most but the highest income families, they have done great damage to our ability to collectively take care of one another and protect the environment. If we collected taxes at the same rate as the share of the economy that we did in 2001, we would have $2.5 billion per year, more than we currently do. That's more than the current budget deficit. It's time to fix the BC tax system so that everyone pays their fair share and we have enough revenues to fund the services we all rely on. And if you're worried about how higher taxes might affect our economic prospects in the future, rest assured, there is no evidence that shows that the level of taxation has any impact on economic growth in a country. In fact, we see both countries that have low taxes and high economic growth and countries that have high taxes and high economic growth. It really is a choice that societies get to make. There are no easy answers in today's slow economy, but there is considerable room for us as a society to make choices. We can choose to have a society which provides high-quality, accessible public services, a society which tackles its most pressing social and environmental problems. Or we can choose to be a low-tax, low-wage society with frayed public services, rising income inequality, and persistently high levels of poverty. I'm afraid that this is the choice that the government's making with this year's budget. With this year's budget, the provincial government is asking lower and middle-income families to tighten our belts, and it's asking public sector workers, including teachers, to keep their wages low for the benefit of the economic recovery. Once growth returns, the government has often argued, the benefits will trickle down to everyone and wages will rise for public sector and private sector workers alike. But we have seen this before, and we have seen that a single-minded pursuit of economic growth hasn't paid off for most BC families. The 2008 recession and the subsequent slow recovery is taking place within the context of a 30-year stagnation of BC family incomes. Wages for full-year, full-time workers in BC now are lower than what their parents' generation used to earn after taking inflation into account. And this is despite the fact that the provincial economy has grown considerably since the late 70s, and real GDP per capita has increased by almost 25%. So it seems clear that economic growth alone isn't sufficient to benefit all families, and prosperity hasn't trickled down to the bottom half. Unless we make some changes in the policies we select and in how we run this province, I'm afraid that a large number of British Columbians will continue to be left behind, even though we have economic growth and prosperity in the future. We must find a way to share prosperity more broadly and more fairly. And this starts with acknowledging that high-quality, accessible public education is the greatest equalizer we have. Public education is how we ensure that we have economic mobility in this society. It's the most reliable and sustainable way to build a better future for everyone, regardless of their parents' means or their background. But the reality is that we can't have great, accessible public education without adequately funding it. And we certainly can't have great public education without treating the hardworking men and women who teach our children with respect and compensating them fairly. We have the fiscal room to do this because our province isn't broke. Economic growth is slow, but it is positive. And government revenues grow in line with nominal economic growth, which is projected to be around 4%. In addition, there is some room to increase revenue through progressive tax reform. Current debt levels, on the other hand, are affordable and they are very low relative to what we see in other provinces in other countries. This means we have room to borrow a little bit more as well. There's nothing prudent about the government's current budget. Underfunding public services will only cause increasing hardship on the most vulnerable among us, and it puts off dealing with our pressing social and environmental problems. We simply cannot afford to wait until the economy gets better to tackle the crisis in seniors' care, to tackle the underfunding in our schools, to tackle the increasing income inequality and persistently high levels of poverty in this province, or to deal with the environmental costs of our purely resource-driven economic growth strategy. Failing to address the root causes of our current problems will only make them more expensive to deal with in the future and puts off the costs for our children to deal with. This is irresponsible. At a time when BC families are already stretched by record high debt levels in a weak job market, reducing the benefits and wages of teachers and other public sector workers will not do anything to get us out of this economic slump. It would only make matters worse. What BC needs instead of government austerity, is strategic public investments to build stronger and more accessible public services that benefit everyone. There's no better place to start than with education.